What happens after death? Could we ever come back?
I think there is some likelihood of life after death.
The answer may come from children, remembering a life before they were born.
Our work provides evidence that we should strongly consider the possibility of reincarnation.
Embark on a scientific search for evidence of reincarnation. Listen to the stories of these children who remember a past life.
Everybody was asleep when the fire came. Mommy and Daddy could not get me out. I stayed with the fire. The fire was hot. I know Mommy and Daddy will be happy when I come back.
The memory of a child, not of death, but of a new life. Is there life after death? An age-old question. At the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, scientists are investigating claims of reincarnation. For over 40 years, they have tried to explain the accounts of young children who speak of a past life. Stories like the one of this girl, who claims to have drowned and is now reborn. Or this 6-year-old boy, who thinks he used to be a New York policeman killed in the line of duty. Or this boy, who remembers having lived as his own grandfather. There are thousands of stories like this, and Dr. Jim Tucker has gathered many of them.
We're investigating cases of very young children who spontaneously begin talking about previous lives. They usually begin between the ages of 2 and 3 and continue until the age of 5 or 6. We're looking at these cases to learn as much as possible about this phenomenon.
Jim Tucker is preparing a research trip to meet one of his subjects, a child claiming to remember a past life.
Gus Ortega is a little boy in Colorado who has talked about being his grandfather. This began when he was 18 months old, and he's made a number of statements that seem quite specific. This one is a stronger case because the child has made some very specific statements that it seems very unlikely he could have heard through normal means.
Gus Ortega's case is only one of many.
We've been studying these cases for the last 40 years. We've now collected over 2,700 cases like this. These cases have been found all over in Asia, in West Africa, they've been found in South America, in Europe, and the United States, pretty much wherever they've been looked for.
The most convincing cases, however, are found on an island south of the Indian subcontinent, in Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka, a mystical place. A place also where people believe strongly in reincarnation. Most of the island's inhabitants are Buddhists. One of the reasons may be why there are so many cases of children remembering a previous life. Professor Erlendur Haraldsson of the University of Iceland, on his way to visit his best case. He has spent over a decade studying the possibility of reincarnation on this island.
Sri Lanka is a good place to study cases of children who speak about a past life, because here you find a few cases every year.
And Haraldsson's cases are more convincing than any American case.
The cases in Sri Lanka and in the United States differ in several respects. First of all, in the States, these are mostly in-family cases. Here in Sri Lanka, in-family cases are rare. I've only had a few. And secondly, the details seem to be greater here in this country.
What makes Haraldson's cases so intriguing is that the children remember not the life of another family member, but that of a complete stranger. Haraldson crosses half the island to meet with his most fascinating research subject, a girl by the name of Dilukshi.
This is a very interesting case because Dilukshi was talking about memories of a previous life for almost 3 years and doing so persistently and repeating the same story over and over again.
The little girl Haraldson is about to meet shocked her parents when she said that she was not really their child. She claimed she had another mother and father elsewhere.
She was saying that she had lived in a place near Tambula, and there was a stream there. She had fallen into a stream and drowned.
Haraldson hopes the trip to meet Dilukshi may yield some answers.
I was always interested in these images or thoughts or behavioral characteristics that are sort of out of tune with their present life. How do they arise? How do they come into these children?
In a place not quite that far away, a hospital in America. An old man is dying. And a young boy believes he is this man reborn. Gus Ortega is a normal 6-year-old. Like most boys, he cherishes his time with his dad. But this relationship is different. Gus remembers that he played with his dad in a previous life. Only then, he was the father, and his dad was his son. This is the case that UVA scientist Jim Tucker is investigating.
Whenever I go to see a case, I go with a certain amount of skepticism. I never go with the assumption that this is reincarnation. And that's also the same approach that I have with the work as a whole. We're here because this is an interesting phenomenon, so we're trying to learn as much about it as possible.
Catch it! Oh, good job!
Grandpa Augie died in 1993. His son Ron found him lying on the floor in his home. A stroke. Grandpa Augie died 5 hours later. He was a shopkeeper. He sold everything people wanted to buy, and he loved his family. But he never met his grandson, Gus. Gus was born 1 year after Grandpa Augie's death. One day, when he was just 1.5 years, Gus was alone in his room with his father.
Ron came out and told me that he had just finished changing Augie's diaper, and that he looked right up at him and said, "You know, Dad, when I was your age, I used to change your diaper."
I was flabbergasted, to be honest with you. I thought it was just kind of strange, especially the choice of words to say that phrase, "when I was your age," for this little 1.5-year-old toddler.
He started talking about Grandpa, and just the little things he was saying that we knew he couldn't have known because he never met Grandpa. His grandfather died a year before he was born. So, yeah, we were pretty puzzled about it.
Then one day, Ron Ortega brought a set of old photos home, and something even more remarkable occurred.
And I said, "Oh, look, look at this old photograph." And he came up to it and he goes, "Oh, there's me." I mean, I was like, just totally astounded, it just stopped me, cold. I mean, because how would he know that?
Gus would make more statements like that over the course of the next years. He would recollect episodes of his grandfather's life that even Ron could hardly remember. And he was there. Gus knew more about his grandfather than he should have. Is this evidence of reincarnation? How else can these children remember another life? The case files of Dr. Jim Tucker will yield more clues. Sri Lanka. On his way to investigate claims of reincarnation, Professor Haraldson and his translator finally arrive at the home of Dilukshi Nisanka. She's the girl who remembers having drowned in a river and is now reborn.
Dilukshi's case is one of the best, perhaps even the best, of the cases that we have studied here in Sri Lanka.
Professor Haraldson has conducted 2 major psychological studies concerning children who remember a past life. Surprisingly, their psychological characteristics are not much different from children who never report such memories, except for one crucial difference.
In the studies I have made on their psychological characteristics, you even find that some of these children tend to have what we call a post-traumatic stress disorder. The question is, how does it get there? They have not experienced anything particularly death-threatening in this life, but they have these images of having died in another life. This may be the reason for this apparent post-traumatic stress disorder.
Has Dilukshi really lived before?
These children, they are experiencing something real. It is psychologically real. They have these images of what they interpret as of a past life, and some of these are concerned with how they died in the alleged previous life. And that's usually a painful way of death. It's a violent death, unexpected death, sudden death.
Could Dilukshi just be making her stories up?
If they were making up some fantasies, then one would expect them rather to make up some fantasies of a better life or something that would be of some satisfaction to them. But to think about how they died is not really a pleasurable fantasy.
For the Nisanka family, Dilukshi's memories are painful. Every time they talk about it, they are reminded that Dilukshi does not feel part of their family. It is especially difficult for her mother.
She first started speaking of her previous life when we took her to Montessori preschool. She also mentioned when we went to the temple that her temple was in a different place. And when we had our meals and went to bed at night, she would again mention her previous life.
In fact, I had become so irritated by what she was saying that I beat her once.
I felt very bad about all of this. Dilukshi was constantly speaking about her previous family. It felt as if she was condemning me for being a bad mother, for not looking after her properly.
Could you tell us what it is that she still remembers?
There was a footbridge across the stream near my house. People from the village would walk across the bridge and bathe in the stream. There was a rock near my house where I used to play shop with my friends. I have always felt that I don't belong in my present family. Their furniture and belongings are different from the family I remember. I remembered very clearly the clothes and goods of my previous family. From my earliest memories, I felt like an outsider, and that I must do whatever I could to find my real family.
අරම්මල දීලා වෙන්න ඇති කියලා.
Which means these memories are real to Delukshi.
The day I died, I went to the stream to swim with a friend of mine. And then, somebody pushed me. I was in the water when I died.
When I was Grandpa Augie, I died in the hospital. When I went to heaven, God gave me a card. Everybody with a card like that is allowed to come back. I want it to come back.
The Ortega home in Colorado. Jim Tucker from the University of Virginia cannot just reject what little Gus has to say about a previous life.
There are certainly a lot of people who will simply dismiss this work because it disagrees too much with their assumptions about how the world works. But to dismiss something because it disagrees with your assumptions is really not very scientific. So we have this phenomenon, and we have the evidence that it's involved with this phenomenon. So the scientific approach is to explore it and learn all we can about it.
The Ortega home in Colorado. Dr. Jim Tucker is interviewing Gus Ortega. Gus claims to have lived before as his grandfather.
And how about your grandmother?
Yeah.
And were you a little boy when you were doing that, or was that when you were big? That's when you were big?
Is Gus telling the truth? Tucker has no way of knowing. That is why the most crucial information in many cases come from the parents. Jim Tucker interviews Kathy and Ron Ortega. Standard procedure.
And when was the next time that he said something that suggested he had information, that he knew things about your dad?
Gus said, I had a sister, but she died. She's a fish now. And we said, she's a fish? What do you mean? What happened? And he said, well, some bad guys hurt her. Mm-hmm. And that really made me stop, because I only recently heard the whole facts of this story about my father's sister, and she indeed was murdered, and she was thrown into San Francisco Bay.
A family secret. Little Gus could never have heard about this story, because even Ron Ortega did not know about his father's sister. How could his son?
I really hadn't thought of reincarnation or even putting that word in connection with what was happening. I wasn't brought up, with learning about reincarnation. I was brought up Southern Baptist, and certainly did not hear about reincarnation.
If you had told me that a year ago, yeah, right. You've come back. Uh-huh. But, now, anything can happen. Yeah, anything.
In his hotel room, Jim Tucker reviews his notes. There are many questions, especially when it comes to same family cases, like the Ortegas.
Whenever we investigate a case, we certainly have to assess the reliability of the informants. With the same family case, we always have the concern that the family members are grieving for the lost family member and therefore have the wish that the child would be returned.
Despite the possible weaknesses with cases like the Ortegas, there are still many questions that nobody seems to have convincing answers to.
Whether you accept the idea that this necessarily means reincarnation, which means a soul that moves from one body to the next, that's for each person to decide.
Professor Haraldson and his translator climbed the steep steps to one of Sri Lanka's most recognizable landmarks, the famous rock temple of Dambulla.
The next step in the investigation of this case leads us here to the Dambulla temple because Diluksy had spoken about it. And then the family, they decided to do something about Diluksy's talk. Diluksy's parents decided to call the abbot living in this temple and ask him if he knew of any girl who had died in this area and who fit the description given by Diluksy. In most of the countries where we find these cases, there is a belief in reincarnation.
If a culture principally allows for the concept of rebirth, does that make reports of previous lives more likely? May that be one of the reasons why the best cases can be found in places like Sri Lanka?
Here in Sri Lanka, we find most of the cases among Buddhist families. Of course, the majority of the population here is Buddhist, about two-thirds. But we also find some cases among Christians, and we even find a few among the Muslims. So the cases in Sri Lanka are found in all the major religious communities.
The key to solving Diluksy's case may very well lie with the abbot of the rock temple. Haraldson and his translator can count on the fact that here, their investigation will be taken seriously, because reincarnation is a common concept for a Buddhist monk.
Buddhism teaches us that reincarnation exists. It happens due to the accumulation of good and bad deeds, which we call karma. Our desire to live in this world pulls us into our next birth, and the number of good and bad deeds we have performed determine the circumstances of our next birth.
But in the case of Diluksy, the abbot is unable to help. He knows of no other family that matches Diluksy's memories. Instead, he refers the scientist to the local newspaper. A personal friend of the abbot's, a journalist, decided to investigate Diluksy's claims after speaking with the monk.
This is how the story continued. Mr. Apipala, he learned about the case. He went and interviewed Diluksy and the parents about what she had been saying about a previous life. It was then published a few days later. And this newspaper has a distribution all over the country.
For the journalist, it was a good story.
I consider this case unique because for over 30 years I've researched these types of stories and have come across various people who talked about their previous births. But this one is one in 1,000.
His readers were enthralled with Delucci's mysterious memories and the remarkable details she remembered. But for now, one question remains unanswered. Will the scientists find a match to Delucci's memories of an earlier life and death? A newspaper journalist had written an article about Delucci's memories of a past life. The article mentioned that the girl thinks she used to live near the Dambula rock temple. Several weeks after the article was published, the mail arrives at the Nisanka home. When the postman handed Mr. Nisanka his mail that day, he was surprised to find one letter postmarked from Dambula. He had no friends or relatives in that part of the country. When he opened the letter, he was stunned.
I was very surprised to receive a letter by a Mr. Ranatunga. He lives in Dambula. I was stunned when I read that his little daughter had died just the way Delucci had always talked about. He talked about the river and the footbridge. His little girl was called Shiromi.
Shiromi's father confirmed many of Delucci's statements, and he said he would like to meet her.
I missed my previous parents very much, and I longed to see them again. After this letter, my second mother was finally convinced, and she agreed we would go and meet with them.
There was nothing her current parents could do. Delucci was now determined to meet the people who she believed were her true family. If they would not take her to them, she threatened to run away. The letter finally convinced Delucci's parents. They were going to take her to the place where she thinks she died. They took Delucci on a 6-hour drive to Dambula. When they came closer to the city, Delucci began to recognize landmarks. She even started to direct the driver toward the house where her previous family lived. Even today, after several meetings, it is still a moving reunion. For Professor Haraldson, a rare opportunity to witness what could be two lives intersecting.
This meeting is quite emotional. It's only about in a third of all cases in Sri Lanka that you are able to find a connection between what a child is saying and a previous family or a person who died that fits the description. This is very rare.
Professor Haraldson is astounded by the change in character as soon as Delucci meets her previous family. She is less withdrawn and seems to fit in much more naturally with this family. Could she really be this little girl, reborn?
Shiromi was a very obedient girl who never left the house without informing us where she was going. She always left the house with her younger brother and her sister to swim or to play. And one day she just did not come back. I was so upset that Shiromi hadn't returned home that I ran about looking for her. When they found her in the water, I fainted upon hearing I'd lost my daughter. When Deluxi was brought here, she was able to recognize us as her previous parents. She was also able to recognize her old belongings and the neighbors who lived nearby. All of this convinced me she was my child reborn.
I know I am that little girl over there in that picture. When I saw my previous parents and previous brother and sister, I felt very happy. It felt like I was finally returning home after a very long time away.
At the end of the day, Deluxi takes Professor Haraldson for a walk to show him the sights of her previous life.
When we compare how well these statements fit the life of Shiromi, we find that about 12 of them, we have around 20, about 12 of them fit really well and are fairly specific.
Deluxi leads Professor Haraldson to the rock, where she claimed she played as little Shiromi. It is a flat rock formation, just as she had described. The footbridge over the little river is also there. And this is the spot where Shiromi fell into the water.
When I come to this particular spot, I become very afraid. In general, I am not afraid of water. But when I come to this spot, I get very scared.
Deluxi tells the scientist that she remembers black spots just before she died. Haraldson thinks the water plants growing in the river might account for this.
I think there is something real there. She has some real images of these events, but I think these images, these thoughts were with her from a very early age and even continue to some extent up to the present day.
Deluxi herself is convinced that she died here, in her previous life. For many who evaluate the evidence that Haraldson and his colleagues have gathered, the answer is simple. If you believe in reincarnation, this research gives some scientific basis to this belief.
I think there is some likelihood of life after death, and I think that there might be something real in these memories, and that would then support the theory of reincarnation.
But despite how convincing Deluxi's case may sound, not everybody agrees with these findings. One of the dissenters is Dr. Richard Wiseman of the University of Hertfordshire, near London. He has taken a long, hard look at the evidence that the reincarnation scientists have compiled.
The question is what's going on there? And I think part of the problem with assessing the situation is you simply don't know the role that chance could play.
In order to answer that question, Wiseman has devised a very simple experiment. He invited a random selection of children into his institute and asked them the same questions that researchers investigating claims of past lives would ask.
The experiment that I carried out was really to test the notion that if you took a child and simply had them make up a story, can you take that information, then go away and compare it to the details of children who unfortunately have actually died and find some kind of match, the type of match that the researchers who are involved in reincarnation claims actually find in their work.
More often than not, the children would easily engage Wiseman in a conversation about dying.
What my experiment aimed to do was to find out the role that chance plays in claims of reincarnation.
Dr. Wiseman videotaped his interviews with the children in order to have a record of their fantasies. After an initial period of shyness, the children opened up and played along with Wiseman's experiment.
One of the children I spoke to was Molly, and we asked her just to make up a story. She came up with the idea of another child called Katie, who was also 3. What colour hair would you have? any colour hair at all?
Red.
You have red hair.
Red hair. Mm-hmm.
She had blue eyes. She was wearing a pink dress with flowers on it. She ran away. When Katie ran away, Molly?
What?
When Katie runs away, the good or bad things happen? Has anything bad ever happened to Katie? Bad? Oh, what's bad that's happened?
The monsters got Katie.
Oh, what were the monsters like?
Ugly.
They were ugly monsters. What happened?
No.
What happened to Katie when the monsters got her?
Monsters bit her.
They bit her. So what happened to Katie?
Died.
She died.
That was the story that Molly came up with. Now, what we wanted to know was, of course, if you took that story and you tried to match it against stories where genuine children, unfortunately, had actually died, could you find a match? And what we found was quite remarkable. We looked through the newspaper archives for stories, often very tragic stories, where children have been involved in accidents or have been abducted, been killed, and so on. One particular story matched the imaginary story that Molly had given us. The actual child was 3 years old. The actual child had red hair, blue eyes, a pink dress with flowers on it. The child lived very close to the seaside and enjoyed going to the beach. One day they ran away from the house, unfortunately were abducted and were killed. So out of the 17 facts that Molly gave us, 13 of them were absolutely correct. Now, if Molly was claiming to have lived before, this would be the reincarnation case of the decade.
Yeah. This result even spooked Molly's mother, who knew for certain that her daughter had only made up the story.
I found that quite shocking. There was actually something that really happened. Because I know even if there's no connection, you sort of instantly feel connected then to something because of what Molly made up. I instantly sort of felt connected, or felt for the parents of that particular child.
The notion that we've lived before is obviously very, very radical, and so part of what I was doing was trying to work out how can we assess the validity of the claims of reincarnation. I don't think we're finding out anything about the paranormal. I don't think we're finding out anything about whether or not we actually live in a previous life. We're finding out a great deal about psychology, about the way in which people can fool us and we can fool ourselves.
But what if there were reincarnation cases that would not ultimately rely only on the memories of young children? Jim Tucker is on his way to another case, from a category of cases that his critics will find much harder to disprove.
The more that the cases were found, one started coming with birthmarks and birth defects, and we found that in many cases there was a striking correlation between the birthmarks on the children and wounds that the previous personalities had. And we've been able to track down autopsy reports or medical records to make sure that in fact there was a match there.
For the first time, these birthmarks provide a physically verifiable piece of evidence suggesting reincarnation.
We don't have a lot of American cases that have the birthmarks or birth defects along with the memories. We do have some, but it's unusual, so we certainly like to investigate all those that we can.
And Jim Tucker is about to visit one of these cases. He is boarding a flight to Florida to meet a boy who remembers being a New York policeman killed in a hail of gunfire.
When I was big, I was a police officer. I walked into a store one night. There were bad guys, too. They shot me dead.
Pensacola, the home of Maria Hagedorn. She is the mother of 2 children, 2-year-old Mia and 5-year-old Ian. Ian is a very sick boy.
What kind of dress do you like to wear?
Maria Hagedorn's son suffers from a very rare heart disease. If he exerts himself too much, he struggles for air and faints. Trips to the family cardiologist are frequent. Continued observation a must. Little Ian had 6 major heart operations before he turned 4.
He was a big, healthy 8.5-pound baby, and they took him off. They said to take a bath, give him a bath. And they never came back. Over an hour went by, so I sent my husband off to find the baby. And he came back quite a bit later with 2 doctors, and they were all crying, very visibly shaken, which I knew that the news was not good.
The doctors told Maria that Ian would not live through his first day. Only an emergency operation would save his life. 6 hours after his birth, Ian underwent major heart surgery.
Ian had underdevelopment of the pulmonary valve, which is the artery right here we see in this drawing, and that caused the right side of his heart not to develop as well. And what that leads to is a lack of oxygen in his blood. So it's a condition where he is essentially suffocating because not enough oxygen is delivered to the brain and to the rest of the body.
Ian's surgery went well. After almost 9 hours, a team of doctors managed to repair the valve. But the underdevelopment of the right side of his heart would take time and more operations. Ian's life is still at risk today. What brings Jim Tucker to this case is an event that took place over a year before Ian was born.
My dad was a police officer, and he walked into Radio Shack, and he could tell something was going on. 2 guys up at the front desk pulled a machine gun out of their overcoat and pointed it at the manager. And my dad pulled his revolver and said, "Drop your weapons, I'm a police officer." And somebody was shooting him quite immediately after he said that.
Jim Tucker and Maria Hagedorn review her father's autopsy report. Eerily, the cause of death jumps out at anyone reading this report. Maria's father died from a ruptured pulmonary artery caused by a gunshot wound, the same artery that is causing Ian's misery. But something else happened that seemed even stranger to Ian's mother.
The first time was when he was about 3, and I was doing some work in my office, and he was making quite a bit of noise, and I had threatened him with a spanking if he didn't quiet down. And he stood there and looked at me and said, "When you were a little girl and I was your daddy, lots of times you were bad and I never spanked you," which just kind of blew me away. He didn't get a spanking.
And then Ian began to talk more about his grandfather.
Growing up, we had 2 cats, a black cat and a white cat, and the black cat was Maniac, and the white cat was Boston. So one day I was doing something, and Ian came over to me, and he said, "Mom, when you were a little girl and I was your daddy, what was my cat's name?" And I said, "Maniac?" And he said, "No, the white one." And I said, "Boston?" And he said, "I used to call him Boss, right?" So he knew the color of the cats, and he knew the nickname that only my dad used to call Boston.
Maria collected more and more stories like this one from Ian. She is now convinced that Ian is her father reborn. It isn't only the stories, but the physical evidence, the correlation between Ian's heart disease and her father's mortal wound that has removed all doubt from her mind.
Much of these cases often involves memories and statements and behaviors. The birthmarks are something that's completely objective, and it's something that it's beyond memory or beyond chance.
Maybe Ian's memory is fooling him. Perhaps his random statements are connected to his grandfather by pure luck. But it's the combination of memory and physical evidence that is so convincing.
I didn't want to go back, but God just gave me to you.
God gave you to your mom? Even though you didn't want to come back?
The case of Ian Hagedorn demands the question, what does all this evidence mean?
There are obviously huge questions here which we haven't even begun to try to answer, such as, is there a soul? If so, what does that term even mean? How does it get carried over from one life to the next? When you look at all these cases, you can certainly focus on the weaknesses if you choose to. But I think there's also enough here so that if you choose, you can step back and say that there may just be something remarkable going on.
If Dr. Tucker is right, the memories of all these children could mean that death may just be a road to another life.